All right, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be updating the Australian Survivor Power Rankings following week 3 or episode 9. And this was an interesting week. I mean, we got the triad swap in this episode, we got some quote unquote big votes. I mean, we can talk about those more along the way. And of course, we'll be ranking all the players in the game based on how likely I think it is that they'll win the game from this point on based largely on Edgic, although I will also be talking a bit about their current game position. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the list. So, starting off the list, we have the three boots of the people that were voted out this week and have 0% chance of winning. But at number 19, we have Sandra, voted out in episode 7. And obviously, she kind of got swap screwed. I mean, she was swapped into the new blood tribe, is reunited with Nina there, but is at a 4 to 6 numbers disadvantage. Jordy talks about her being a big threat. She has a confessional about how the swap changes things. She knows she has a target and how she needs to lay low. Talks to David about how they should start fresh. Says she's lucky to be on a tribe with Nina. Asserts that Nina will come to her when needed. She's proud of the game Nina's played and feels like she can lean into that. Believes Mel is a target and talks more about the day 16 curse, but we see Jordy orchestrating her blindside. Despite Nina telling her she needs to step up her game, she remains convinced she won't be targeted. Not a great look there. And then ultimately, she's voted out unanimously. So overall, I'm not too surprised Sandra was voted out given how many people talked about her being a big threat. I was a little shocked by how much the day 16 curse factored into the edit to where it made me expect and hope that she would break it even if she were taken out shortly afterwards. But as I said in each of these power rankings, I never thought Sandra had that much of a chance of winning the game, and that belief was solidified as we heard more and more people talk about how big of a threat Sandra was. Granted, some of her longevity came from her threat level, allowing people like Jesse to use her as a meat shield, and I think the edit gives her a little too much credit for certain moves, particularly the J vote, but I also think she did some good work on her initial blood tribe, building solid bonds with Sam, Michelle, and most of the men. I also think she kind of gets swap screwed where she was put on the same tribe as Nina, which that alone makes her threat level too big to ignore, but also separated from all of her allies on her original tribe, being left with Amy and David, who had already turned on her at that point, and 6 original Water Tribe members, who, with the exception of Nina, had zero reason to keep her around. So it makes sense why she was taken out here. And on the whole, I feel like this doesn't change her legacy too much. I mean, I feel like this run was somewhat similar to what we saw from her on Game Changers and Winners Hell War, where for one, she was voted out on day 16. But even beyond that, we saw people initially keep her around in order to have a meat shield in front of them. And she did get a good job building bonds with people. But once she got to the swap, she was around people that didn't have that connection with her and therefore had no reason to keep her around. So she was voted out as a result. I feel like this doesn't really change her legacy too much. I mean, people will still call her the Queen of Survivor, and I feel like this doesn't significantly decrease her game ability or what we've seen from her. But I feel like I understand why she was voted out here, and she's here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, and we have the next boot on the list. We have Sophie, and Sophie's an interesting person to talk about. So obviously in episode 7, she swapped onto the Water Tribe. She stays with KJ and has a 5 to 4 original numbers advantage, but a 4 to 5 disadvantage with her more recent tribe. She talks to Sam about her blind side, but nothing aside from that. And then there's a booter episode, episode 8, where Sam still wants to target her. She talks to Ben about her blind side and how she's hungry for revenge, kind of continuing that storyline. We see KJ talk about Sophie's game being more out in front of her than her own. Sam asks her who she thinks went home in the last tribal and says she says Jordan. However, Sam disagrees. Sam asks if she's targeting her, to which Sophie says it depends. KJ joins the conversation. However, Sophie walks away feeling like her own sister doesn't have her back, which is just weird. After the challenge, she's the main target as part of the split vote plan. While she wants to get rid of Sam, she knows she doesn't have the numbers for that. So she goes to Sam, Ben, Croc, and Chrissy and proposes a separate split vote plan to flush Khan's idol. Later on, we see her look for idols, but we know there shouldn't be one as, well, Croc found it in the last episode. And at the last moment, she acts like she has found one. However, obviously, we know that she didn't. And while she throws her vote in the con, Sam's plan prevails, and Sophie's vote is voted out once again, and this time it's for real. So overall, Sophie was a pretty big character in the pre-merge. I actually thought she would have been in for the long haul as a villain and source of chaos. However, it turns out she fit the big pre-merge character mold after all. But obviously, she played a terrible game. I mean, she started off all right with her and Ben running the initial Blood Tribe. She builds a fairly solid alliance with most of the men, but then that group falls on the outs with her being the perceived leader is voted out in episode 4. And while she gets a second chance by going over to the Water Tribe, she plays very emotionally from that point on. The way she handles her former trimates is pretty terrible. I mean, getting mad at Sam is understandable, but the fact that she blows up at her own allies who voted to save her is pretty ridiculous in my view. In theory, she could have been in a good position being on the same tribe as KJ, as it didn't seem that the tribe was bothered by them being a pair, but she became so focused on trying to get revenge that it completely ruined any potential of that working out for her. And then at the swap, not much changed and she was voted out. I mean, something I wondered about is how much her bad gameplay was due to her feeling emotional and bitter after being voted out the first time, or if she just wasn't that good socially to begin with. And while we may learn more later that changes things, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I don't think Sophie was that good socially coming in. The main reason she started off decently was due to the makeup of her tribe. I mean, I feel like those alpha males in Ben and Croc were just people she clicked well with. And while she struggled to build bonds with most of the rest of her tribe. And she also seems like the type of person that would take things personally, such as being blindsided, which clouds her judgment. And when you combine that with obviously her not being that good socially to begin with, I mean, yeah, it kind of makes sense why she kind of squanders the second chance and doesn't really do well afterwards. So on the whole, I think Sophie was an interesting figure in the season, but not that great of a player. And because of that, she's here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have the other boot from this week. We have Amy, and this was a bit of a surprise for me. I wasn't expecting her to be a pre-merge character, but here we are. Obviously, in episode 7, she swapped onto the Blood Tribe. She has a 4 to 6 original numbers disadvantage. Nina talks to her about keeping Sandra, but aside from that, not much there. And she gets no content in episode 8. Then, obviously, episode 9 is where she gets a bit more content where she has a confessional about how she's on the outs based on the original tribe lines. It's tough to figure out the dynamics on her new tribe, and she feels like she's on the outs. Mark asks her if she was tight with Jordan before, and she says she was close to Jordan and Sam. Mark says Jordan's a good guy. She talks more in the confessional about how she was close to Jordan before, but since the swap, Jordan has gravitated more towards Josh and she feels excluded. Mark tells her that being on a tribe with your loved one, referring to Josh and Jordan, seems like it would give you more protection, but it really doesn't, which she agrees with. After the challenge, she talks to Jordan about the vote. She has a confessional about not being as close to Jordan anymore since the swap, and that she wants to blindside Jordan. She talks to David and Mel about the Jordan plan, which they agree to. She talks to Mark about it, who's open to it. With that, she feels like Shae is a swing vote, and she feels like it'll be difficult to get her vote. She talks to Shae and pitches a Jordan plan. And as her name is being tossed around, she talks to Nina about the Jordan plan, and ultimately she's voted out. And overall, Amy was another fairly notable pre-merge character, and one of the bigger players strategically. She initially started off in a decent position, building a core with David and Jay that had some control during those early votes, and I give her a decent amount of credit for her Sophie blindside. And even at the swap, I don't think she was in that bad of a position either, having David, having Jordan, and having potential allies in Mel, Nina, Shae, even Josh. Where I think she falters is one, taking the shot at Josh and Jordan way too early. Because even if Jordan was getting closer to Josh, I feel like she could have done work to at least be the third in that pairing, getting two numbers for her and hiding behind a bigger target. But even take that out, I think she chooses the wrong target in Jordan. I kind of understand why she didn't want to take the shot at Josh, as it seems like he was better insulated and people weren't willing to flip on him. But I think that further demonstrates that this was not the right time to be taking a shot anyway. Jordan is someone she was close with from early on. And I feel like targeting the half of the duo she was closer with comes off as sketchy, lowering the chances of anyone working with her. So, on the whole, I feel like Amy had some potential in the game, and I thought the stepping out of Khan's shadow storyline would have been more relevant. But with her misplaying this round and that storyline never really coming up on the show after the premiere, it's not surprising she went out in this spot. And it's just a shame that she went out this early, but that's just the way it is. And she's here at number 17. And with that, we are now moving on to the 16 people still in the game. And like I said, I'll be ranking these people based on how likely I think it is that they'll win the game from this point. This is not a ranking of their overall game, as well as what I think of their game as a whole. This is just a ranking of how likely I think it is that they'll win, largely based on the edit, although also talking about their game to a certain extent. But at number 16, the person I think is the least likely to win Australian Survivor Blood versus Water is Mel. And like I said, I did think about this a bit, but I feel like Mel has just been largely invisible to this point. I mean, this week is no different. I mean, in episode 7, she swapped into the Blood Tribe, has a 6-4 original numbers advantage. Nina talks to her about keeping Sandra, and she is the initial target due to her challenge weakness, which isn't great, but the target shifts to Sandra, of course. In episode 8, Mark calls her a floater, and the men's alliance agree to target her. And aside from that, no content from her. In episode 9, we hear Josh and the guys agree to target her again, claiming that she's weak and latches on the mark. And after the immunity challenge, like I said, she is the initial target. She's not only seen as weak, but someone that plays the middle and never commits to anything. Amy approaches her and David about targeting Jordan, where she says that Jordan is a threat. And again, nothing aside from that. So overall, this was not a great week for Mel. While we learn a bit more about her position on a new tribe, which isn't very good, we don't hear much from Mel herself, and she gets no credit for saving herself at any of the tribals they attend at that point. And I feel like she'll continue to be a target moving forward. I don't really feel good about her game position either, where, again, a lot of people just don't really trust her that much or at least see her as a weakness. They don't really see much value in keeping her around. And again, the fact that we know almost nothing about her as a person, to where we at least know a little bit more about her twin sister Michelle, is a big reason that I have her here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we have someone I literally just mentioned. It is Michelle. And like Mel, Michelle is someone, again, hasn't gotten that much content. We don't really know much about her, and she's not in that great of a game position either. So in episode 7, she swapped into the Water Tribe, has a 5-4 original numbers advantage. And aside from that, no content. No content in episode 8 either. And in episode 9, we hear Sam talk about how she's going to vote out either Michelle or KJ next, how they're the next two targets. And aside from that, no content. So overall, this was a pretty invisible week from Michelle. I mean, I noted previously that a lot of her content was centered around her being aligned with Sandra. Now that she's separated from Sandra and Sandra's out of the game, it feels like she's become irrelevant. And now that we're hearing her being a potential target at the next few tribals, none of that really bodes well for her. I wouldn't be surprised if she actually was voted out at one of these next couple tribals. It doesn't really feel like she has many allies in the game. It feels like she kind of put all of her eggs in the Sandra basket, and with her being on this bad tribe, I feel like she's bound to be picked off. So because of that, I have her here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we have another person that's been largely invisible up to this point, and here we have David. And aside from that little arc he had earlier on, I feel like he hasn't really contributed nothing to the season. I mean, in episode 7, he is swapped into the Blood Tribe, has a 4-6 original numbers disadvantage, and aside from that, no content. No content in episode 8 either. And in episode 9, he's shown talking with Josh and Jordan about the Mel vote. Amy talks to him about the Jordan plan, which he seems to agree with, and then ultimately he's one of the few people to vote for Mel. So obviously losing Amy in the process. And overall, again, this was another largely invisible week for David, with virtually no content in episode 7 or 8, and even in episode 9, where we see the power players pitching their plans to him, we never hear his thoughts on things. And ultimately, he loses Amy, who was a pretty close ally of his, putting him in a pretty bad position. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if he was voted out next as an easy vote, or if he gets dragged along for being a non threat. I mean, I don't really see much of a path moving forward for David to actually win the game, let alone being a serious power player in the game. Although he could get dragged along, and through that, he could be in the majority, but I don't think he's actually winning the game. And because of that, I'm here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we have someone who's gotten a bit more screen time than some of the people we just mentioned. I'm still not feeling that great about him. And here we have Ben. And like I said, Ben didn't have that great of a week either. I mean, in episode 7, he swapped onto the Water Tribe, has a 5 to 4 original numbers advantage. Aside from that, no content there. Episode 8, Sophie approaches him about the split vote plan to flush Khan's idol. He later approaches Jesse, Sam, and Chrissy, where he seems to be confused about which plan to go with. Probably not the greatest look there. And he later supervises Sophie as she's idol hunting, but doesn't really amount to much there. And in episode 9, he's very upset to lose the reward, feeling like it was his fault. We see him beating himself up about it, kind of learning a bit about him. Although this scene is kind of portrayed negatively, where we hear Chrissy telling him he needs to be the tribe's rock and that he needs to pull it together. This leads to Khan targeting him as well. I mean, not that great of a look either. So overall, this wasn't a great week for Ben either. I mean, he didn't get that much screen time, and when he did, it was largely negative. I mean, gameplay wise, I felt like he was an all right swap for him, where he has an original numbers advantage. He has Jesse, Croc, Sophie, and even Chrissy as allies. And while losing Sophie wasn't ideal, I mean, there wasn't much he could do there. But now we're hearing Khan start to target him. Again, not ideal. And on the whole, I don't think that much changed about Ben in terms of how I view him as a winner candidate for me. Again, not really much was contributed towards Ben being an actual winner. And because of that, I have him here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12. And again, someone who got a bit of content this week, but not enough to really move the needle that much. And here we have KJ. And again, this was a bit of a mixed bag for KJ. I mean, in episode 7, she swapped onto the Water Tribe, stays with Sophie there, has a 4 to 5 original numbers disadvantage. But aside from that, no content in episode 7. In episode 8 was a bit of her big episode of the week where she talks about how she and Sophie are playing different games. Hers is based on building relationships and laying low, while Sophie is more out in front. She's the backup target of the split vote plan between her and Sophie. Later on, Sophie looks for idols, which Chrissy notices. She expresses to Chrissy her frustration with Sophie's actions. She gets a confessional about how managing Sophie could compromise her own relationships. Croc tells her about the split vote plan and comforts her. She talks to Khan and says she's tired of Sophie being a source of drama. And while she wants to be loyal to Sophie, she ultimately contributes to the split vote plan and votes out her own sister. And like I said, she's the fifth person to lose her partner in the game. That's just something I kind of been keeping track of. And leading into episode 9, she does have a confessional at the beginning about voting out Sophie. She says it was selfish and out of self preservation, and hopes that Sophie will forgive her. But aside from that, not much else is positive. I mean, we hear Khan even say that he would like to vote KJ out in like one of the next couple of tribals if they go back, which isn't that great of a sign. So overall, this was not that great of a week for KJ. While she got a visibility spike in episode 8, that was mostly because of Sophie and KJ once again being worried about her sister blowing up her game. And while I think the show made a bigger deal of KJ voting out her sister than it did about Nina voting out her mom, which we'll be talking about later, it didn't really lead to anything, and she went right back to being under the radar in episode 9. And sure, she talks a bit about the previous tribal, but again, we're hearing her name being talked about as a target, and we never see KJ respond to this or trying to regroup after losing her sister. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if she was voted out unceremoniously at one of these next few tribals, or even later down the line. So on the whole, I feel like she's not that big of a player. I feel like she's largely been relevant because of the Sophie drama, and that now that Sophie's out of the game, I feel like that'll sort of reduce her role potentially moving forward. Where again, I always saw KJ and her storyline being her teaching Sophie how to play Survivor, and now that Sophie's gone, I don't really see where she fits into the narrative moving forward, which will probably mean she's not going to get that much content. And again, while I think she has some strategic capability, I don't think she's really going to factor too much into things. So because of that, I have her here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we have someone who's been getting a consistent presence, but I feel like a lot of it's been mixed. And here we have Jordan. And like I said, this was a pretty mixed week for him. So in episode 7, he swapped into the Blood Tribe, is reunited with Josh, and has a 4 to 6 original numbers disadvantage. Even so, we see Jordy's happy to have him on the tribe, but aside from that, we don't really hear from him otherwise. In episode 8, he's shown talking to Jordy and Mark, and they agree to target Mel, the next tribal. But aside from that, no content. Episode 9, though, is where we see and get a bit more screen time, where obviously Amy talks about how she used to be closer to Jordan, but now feels isolated since the swap because he's been spending more time with Josh. He talks to Josh about being together on the same tribe and how they could be in danger. Has a confessional about losing the immunity challenge later on and feeling vulnerable. He feels like he's only in the majority because Josh and his relationships with the original Water Tribe. Amy pulls him aside, which he's fine with as he's tight with her. He tells Amy that Mel is a target, but then we get a confessional of Amy wanting to target him. Later on, Shae tells Josh about the plan, prompting him to tell Jordan about the Amy plan. He has a confessional about being fortunate to be with Josh, and ultimately, he's one of the few people to vote for Mel for some reason. Again, that's not really explained, but it doesn't matter as Amy goes home. So, overall, this wasn't a great week for Jordan. Despite being one of the people to be reunited with his partner at the swap, this doesn't get that much focus until episode 9 when it's relevant to the vote. While it's received some attention early on, his relationship with Amy becomes a major storyline in episode 9 and how it has deteriorated due to him spending more time with Josh. And obviously that's not great gameplay as he's making his own ally feel isolated. But what's crazier is that instead of targeting Josh as a way to get closer to him, Amy decides to target Jordan directly. And while I think it's the wrong strategic decision for Amy and a big reason why she goes home, it's still a knock on Jordan that he alienated Amy so much that she no longer sees any potential in working with him. But even beyond that, Josh gets the bulk of the credit for saving Jordan. And we even hear Jordan say at a point that he's depending on Josh to stay out of danger, which just isn't that great of a look, in my opinion. So, on the whole, I feel like Jordan is someone, again, he has been getting a somewhat consistent presence as we've now had several episodes where he's kind of been getting some attention. But I feel like this episode was probably not the best look for him. And when you add that with him not getting that much attention outside of that, I feel like 12 is about as high as I can put him. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have a weird one to talk about. It's literally someone I just mentioned. It is Josh. And this was a bizarre week for Josh. Now, again, most of it was pretty, by the books. I mean, in episode 7, he swapped into the Blood Tribe, is reunited with Jordan, has a 6 to 4 original numbers advantage. We hear Jordy talking about being happy to have him on the tribe. But aside from that, like nothing there. In episode 8, like he's shown talking to Jordy, Jordan, and Mark, and they agree to target Mel. But aside from that, no content. Then in episode 9, Amy says that Jordan has been spending more time with Josh since the swap, making her feel left out. And then we finally hear Josh talking confessional about feeling good about the tribe swap and that he's happy to be with Jordan. Like he talks to Jordan about how it's dangerous for them to be together on the tribe. They feel like it'll be a big move to target them. He says he's been playing an under the radar game, but knows he can take control when the time comes. And then he gets an individual intro package for some reason, talking about him being a pilot, which has taught him to think strategically. He wants to build another ally to avoid danger, which leads him to approach Nina about working together. Again, she agrees to it. Nina says she trusts Josh the most, that the power in the tribe is with him and Jordan, and that she's happy being his number two. However, it's also implied she would eventually turn on him to play her own game. After the reward, he has a confessional about being a move ahead of his opponent. He wants to target Mel due to her being a challenge weakness and latching herself on the Mark. He talks about this plan with his allies. After losing the immunity challenge, he's determined to target Mel, saying she's weak, has been playing the middle, and doesn't contribute anything. Later on, he's a confessional about there being a chance something else is going on. Sure enough, JL tells him that Amy is targeting Jordan, prompting him to switch the target to Amy. He then makes a pitch to uh like David, Mark, and Nina with a split vote plan. to vote out Amy. And then, of course, he gets his way voting out Amy in the process. So that was a lot. I mean, and it's crazy too because before episode 9, Josh was invisible in the edit. But then episode 9 sees this ridiculous visibility spike for him. Not only getting an individual inter package, but also tons of strategic content, and obviously he gets his way. And my immediate thought was that this would be Josh's boot episode. I mean, when we hear Amy talk about how Josh is the reason Jordan isn't close to her anymore, this only strengthened that belief that she would target Josh, blindside him, and then use that to get back with Jordan. But then all that went out the window when we hear Amy's targeting Jordan, and Josh is never even mentioned as a possibility to go home. And yes, while Nina and Shael get content for being swing votes, the episode ultimately solidifies Josh as a strategic force. Now, gameplay wise, I think he's also in a decent position as a leader for the new Blood Tribe. The fact that even Amy didn't consider targeting him over Jordan goes to show how insulated he is for the time being. So, I mean, that was something. Even so, none of this is enough to make Josh a winner candidate. For one, if he was truly a frontrunner, he would have gotten at least some content before this point, some exposure. I mean, I feel like if anything, all this Josh content is there to prop up Nina's edit. And who talks about wanting to hide behind Josh for the time being. I'm expecting Nina to eventually orchestrate the Josh blindside. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this happens right before the merge, take down a giant, and solidify her case as a frontrunner. So again, I'm not too impressed by all this Josh content. Like I said, I feel like it's mostly there to prop up Nina's edit more so than his own. And again, he was largely relevant in this episode, but again, got nothing before this one, and I knew nothing about him. And yes, this did feel a bit compensating, but it's just not enough for me to have him too much higher. So he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone who's largely similar to Josh. However, obviously he's been getting a much more consistent presence on the season. And here we have Khan. And I feel like this week didn't really do much to change my view on Khan. I mean, in episode 7, he swapped into the Water Tribe, has a 4 to 5 original numbers disadvantage. But aside from that, no content. In episode 8, he has fun with the tribe by putting on a cooking show. Later on, Sophie targets him by devising a split vote plan designed to flush his idol. KJ talks to her about Sophie and says that KJ should do what's best for her own game. And but aside from that, we don't really hear much from Khan. And ultimately, that split vote plan was kind of a fake. And obviously, none of it really matters that much. In episode 9, Sam talks to him about KJ. He wonders whether there was a possibility his idol could have been flushed. He then tells Sam that he trusts her and Chrissy, and through that, like they have most of their tribe. He also assures Sam that if they got to the merge together, he would use his idol for the group instead of just himself. And then after the reward, he has a confessional about how low the morale has been on the tribe. However, he's confused by it. I mean, he doesn't care about the reward and he wants to be safe. He feels like if they can win some immunities, he'll make it to the merge. Even so, he feels like losing rewards is useful as it reveals who he should target. He talks to Sam about how Ben has been reacting poorly to challenge losses, feeling like it's all his fault. He then decides to target Ben, saying that it's no longer a brawn game. He continues saying he enjoys control and wants to win immunity so he can hold on to his idol. He's the sixth person to lose his partner in Amy, of course, but it doesn't matter too much. So overall, Khan remains a pretty big character, but I don't think his win equity has increased that much. If anything, it only solidified my belief that he's being set up for a downfall. And at this point, I'm on the fence over whether it'll happen before the merge or after. I mean, on one hand, given how big his edit has been, and given the fact that he's talked about how winning immunity is part of his strategy, it would make sense for him to be a big blindside right before the merge, kind of like AK from 2017 or Simon from Brains versus Brawn. But on the other hand, we've seen both Mark and Sam align with Khan, only for each of them to discuss how big of a threat he is. And to me, it would make the most sense if Mark and Sam work together to blindside him and share the credit for the move. I mean, I think regardless, one of them will be credited with voted out Khan. It's just a matter of whether it'll be solely Sam if it's pre-merge, or if it's her and Mark, or maybe just Mark if it's at the merge. Like I said, I don't think he's winning the game or getting close to the end, but he has been a big character nonetheless. And because of that, he's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and I wasn't too sure what to do with these next two. I mean, these are people who kind of were invisible this week, but also people that I think still have potential to be big players in the game. But here we have Jesse, and like I said, this was a disappointing week for Jesse, screen time wise. I mean, in episode 7, he swapped into the Water Tribe. He has a 5 to 4 original numbers advantage, but aside from that, no content. In episode 8, he and his allies are shown being confused about the split vote plan, which probably isn't the best look. He then suggests that it makes more sense to flush the idol, follow the calm plan, but obviously that doesn't go through and they stick with the Sophie plan. And in episode 9, he talks to Chrissy about the previous tribal, but aside from that, no content. So overall, this was a disappointing week for Jesse. Despite the swap being this important shift in the game, we hear almost nothing from him. We don't know his actual thoughts in the game, and he doesn't appear all that important in the vote, which is sort of a big knock in my view, and a big reason that I have him this low. But the reason I have him above Khan and Josh is because I feel like he's more likely to make a deep run than those two. I feel like he's someone who will definitely make the merge, someone who may be a factor in certain votes. However, he'll probably be taken out due to being a big threat. And because of that, I have him here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have someone who's kind of similar to Jesse, and actually someone who's dropped off more than Jesse from this previous week. And here we have Shae, and this was sort of my breaking point with her. I feel like she's no longer a top contender in my view, based on the edit she's gotten this week. So in episode 7, she swapped into the Blood Tribe, has a 6 to 4 original numbers advantage. Nina talks to her about keeping Sandra, shown talking to Sandra and Nina, and assured them that Mel is a target. In that tribal, she wastes her idol on herself, despite not being shown to be in any danger. In an episode 8, she comments about how quiet it is without Sandra around, but aside from that, no content. In an episode 9, she has a confessional about winning the rewards, saying that it boosts morale and allows her to connect with more of the tribe. She agrees to target Mel, talking to Nina and Mark about it. Amy talks to her as a swing vote and makes her pitch to her. However, Shael decides to leak the plan to Josh, ultimately committing to the Amy vote, and through that, Amy goes home. So, overall, this was a largely disappointing week for Shael as well, to the point where I no longer consider her a top contender. For me, the breaking point was in episode 7, where she doesn't get to explain her decision in using her idol. I mentioned back in week 1 that I was hoping Shael not using her idol on Brianna would later come back to be a big storyline. She would explain how she needed to hold on to it until she could use it to make a big move, which I thought at the time was blindsided Khan. But for her to unceremoniously use it on herself without explanation in a spot where she didn't seem to be any danger is incredibly damning. I'm not saying she should have used it on Sandra, as there would have been no strategic benefit for her to upset the entire tribe just to keep around a big threat with no allegiance to her. But the fact that she never gets a spot to explain her decision is what kills her winning chances in my eyes. Episode 8 isn't much better, and her episode 9 was okay, as she was kind of shown as a swing vote, but even then I felt like Nina took up that role more so than her. So because of that, I feel like I'm kind of out on Shayla at this point. I no longer see her as that serious of a winner candidate. She might get some more positive content here or there, but I feel like with the idol not being used in an effective way is what really kills her. And the fact that she hasn't been getting that much content up to this point is what leaves her here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have a pretty interesting person to talk about, and we have Jordy. And this was definitely a bigger week for Jordy. I mean, in episode 7, he swapped into the Blood Tribe, has a 6 to 4 original numbers advantage, has a confessional about being happy with the swap. He has Josh, Jordan, Mark, and while he likes Nina, he sees Sandra as a big threat, and we see the rest of the tribe center around him. Despite Mel being seen as the initial target, he thinks this is a good opportunity to vote out Sandra, which she ends up doing. In episode 8, he gets a confessional about how crazy the vote was and how he needs to apologize. And sure enough, he's seen apologizing to Nina. He gets a confessional about how Nina voting out Sandra proved her loyalty and how it was a big move for him. He calls Sandra a big threat, so getting her out was a big deal. He then talks about how he wants people to see him as this fun loving guy, but deep down, he's capable of deception. He then talks to Josh, Jordan, and Mark about the game and agrees to target Mel. And in episode 9, he's shown working with Josh and Jordan and agrees to go along with their plans. And obviously through that, he votes out Amy. So overall, this was a relatively big week for Jordy. The show seems to be establishing him as a power player on his swap tribe, building upon his perception early on as someone that's well liked. We hear from him that this is part of his strategy of coming off as a goofball while also being capable of deception. And while he's mostly a background character for the Amy blindside, he gets the most credit for the Sandra move, which is the more impressive one, at least from an edge perspective. And while there's still a possibility he could be a surprise pre-merge boot, I feel like he'll probably make it to merge and be a big further there. However, he'll still probably be voted out sooner rather than later. I don't really see him winning the game, but I think he'll still be a major force in the season. And because of that, I have him here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have another pretty interesting person to talk about. And here we have Croc. And this was another good week for Croc as well. I mean, in episode 7, he swapped onto the Water Tribe, is reunited with Chrissy. He's put at a 5-4 original numbers advantage. Chrissy hands him the clue she found, but then walks out to talk to her about it. Has a confession about having Chrissy on his tribe, and while it paints a target on their back, he feels good that the idol will propel both of them to the merge. He admits to not knowing the camp and has to rely on Chrissy to navigate it. The two of them go idol hunting, and sure enough, Croc is the one to find the idol. He tells Chrissy Sandra's advice about not telling anyone about it and using it to get both of them to emerge. He knows Chrissy is excited, but needs her to not spill the beans, and we see that kind of happen. In episode 8, Sophie approaches him with a split vote plan to flush Khan's idol. However, we get a confessional of him playing both sides and stating that his true allegiance is to Sanspran of voting out Sophie. Even so, he acknowledges that getting rid of Khan would be a smart idea. He hopes that no one gets confused about the fake plan. Later on, he talks to Chrissy about the plan and realizes there was some confusion. He gets a confessional about it and hopes that explaining it to Chrissy again should help. He's worried that Sophie is a smart player and could find a way to save herself. In episode 9, Chrissy talks to him about how difficult the game has been, but aside from that, no content. So overall, this was another decent week for Croc. He gets a pretty good swap and isn't being targeted despite being one of the people to reunite with their loved one. There's a storyline of him and Chrissy getting to the merge together using their idol. We get plenty of content of him talking strategy and him weighing out his options. He's also shown being supportive towards Chrissy, helping her deal with both the strategic and emotional aspects of the game. And like I said, he sticks out as a pretty notable contender in my eyes. I feel like he is pretty well respected and will probably make, like at least the merge. It's just a question of whether he'll be targeted for being such a big threat. And obviously, he's not the only big physical person on this cast. However, I do suspect that he'll still probably be targeted soon, if not for being a physical player, then at least for being perceived as a leader that's also a big threat. So there's that. I think Chrissy will ultimately outlast him in the game, but I still am somewhat impressed by Croc's game, and I feel like the edit is kind of backing him up. So because of that, I have him here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we have someone who's pretty similar to Croc, but I feel like they have a bit more longevity. And here we have Chrissy. And like I said, I feel like Chrissy will probably outlast Croc at the end of the day, but obviously this was also a good week for her edit wise. In episode 7, she swapped onto the Water Tribe, is reunited with Croc, has a 4-5 original numbers disadvantage. She has a confessional about winning the reward. She spots a hidden clue at the reward and attempts to grab it. Sure enough, she does, undetected. She's excited that she not only has Croc, but now has a clue as well. And as the two are walking, she sneakily hands it to him. Goes idol hunting with Croc, and sure enough, Croc finds the idol. And we don't really see much from her other than that. Episode 8, Sophie approaches her about the split vote plan to flush Khan's idol. And after some confusion breaks out over the split vote plan, she gets a confessional talking about it. She calls the situation a hot mess. She talks to Croc about it, who tells her the Khan plan is fake. He says the real plan is 5 on Sophie and 2 on KJ. She notices Sophie idol hunting and talks to KJ about it, who's frustrated about the whole situation. Understandable enough. And sure enough, she's in the majority. She votes out Sophie. And in episode 9, she talks to Jesse about the previous tribals. She tells Sam she would vote out Michelle next and KJ after that. She also admits to being scared of Khan's idol. Khan tells Sam that he trusts Chrissy, which is a good sign. Has a confessional about her tribe being on a losing streak. She talks to Croc about being hungry and tired. She also says it's been hard being away from the rest of her family, that she sacrificed a lot, and all this just feels very personal for her. Ultimately, she realizes she needs to stop doubting herself and find the good. Sure enough, they win the immunity challenge, and that'll do it for her. So, overall, this was a bit of a bounce back for her after a pretty quiet week, too. Obviously, a lot of her content is about her reuniting with Croc and the two of them playing the game together, although we're continuing to see her manage her own relationships, particularly with Khan. I still think she'll be in it for the long haul and wouldn't be surprised if she outlasted Croc and we saw a storyline of her having to play her on her own, but I still wouldn't consider her a top contender. I feel like these top three people we'll be talking about are all kind of in a league of their own. But with Chrissy having the edit that she has, and given her position in the game, I feel like number four is a good place to put her. Now we're moving on to number three. And like I said, I feel like these top three are kind of in a league of their own. I feel like there's a massive gap between number four and number three. However, to be fair, there's also a gap between number three and the top two. But at number three, we have Nina. And again, I feel like this was a pretty good bounce back for her. In episode seven, she talks about how comfortable she feels at the Water Tribe and how she has a strong group around her. She thinks she can dominate the tribe and how she sees herself going far. Once a trop is announced, she's worried she'll be on the same tribe as Sandra, as that could ruin her game. Sure enough, she is swapped into the blood tribe with Sandra. She has a 6 to 4 numbers advantage. Jordy says he likes her, but sees Sandra as a big threat. Has a confessional about how the swap didn't ruin her game as she got to be with her allies while also being with Sandra. Talks about being the only mother daughter pair in the game and likes how Sandra has previous survivor experience. She wants to keep Sandra around but isn't sure if that'll be possible. She talks to Mel about keeping Sandra. She knows it'll be difficult and considers cutting Sandra and is shown being in the loop about the Sandra plan but is uncomfortable about it. And of course, we had the moment where she votes out her mom in what was already a unanimous vote, so it doesn't really change too much there. And obviously, she's the fourth person to lose her partner in the game, which is something. In episode 8, she talked about how she voted out her mom. While she wishes it was someone else, she isn't surprised Sandra was voted out. Jordy apologizes to her about the vote. The next day, she talks in confessional about how tough it is. She wanted to put her emotions aside and did just that at the last tribal. And then ultimately, she thinks voting out Nina adds to her resume. She then catches a fish, which impresses the tribe. And in episode 9, we see Josh approach her about working together, which he agrees to. She tells him she wants to be in the majority and that she doesn't want to play with just women. She's open to playing with strong men as well. In confessional, she says she trusts Josh as he's straightforward and they're on the same page. She says the power in the tribe sits with Josh and Jordan. So while she wants to work with Josh, she's here to play her own game. So she's happy being with Josh as number two for the time being. Okay. After the immunity challenge, he talks to Shae about targeting Mel, which he agrees to and adds that Mel never commits to anything. Later on, she's pulled into Josh's Amy plan. She finds that interesting as she assumed Amy and Jordan were close. She then pulls aside Amy to talk about it. She also notes in confessional that everyone is fine with her joining their conversations, which is kind of a telling thing. Amy proposes her plan to her. She tells her Amy that she wants to be with Josh, but Jordan being there complicates things. And then, of course, Nina's part of the plan to vote out Amy. So, overall, this was a massive week for Nina and one that she needed following a pretty quiet week. I mean, she's shown having to keep her eye on Sandra, even talking about how it may not be possible without blowing up her game. We get the moment where she votes out her mom out of the, like, which was to be expected. I mean, she talks about it in the next episode, kind of like what KJ did after voting out but Sophie. But what separates Nina from KJ is that we see Nina actively working afterwards, building bonds with the rest of her tribe and playing her own game. We see her align with Josh, and we see her kind of being in the middle of things. And again, her and Shael are the swing votes at this tribal where she obviously sides with the majority there. And I feel pretty good about Nia at this point. I mean, I feel like something that really held me back from putting her higher, I mean, even in the preseason, is the fact that she was playing with Sandra and that She obviously would have the target of being Sandra's daughter, but not the upside being a meat shield. But inherently, I didn't think she was that bad of a player. And I feel like if she was just coming in on her own, that she could have been this good player. But now that Sandra's out of the game and she doesn't quite have that target anymore, she is able to play her own game and she is able to not have to worry about Sandra like making her target too big. And we see her being quite effective. And the edit is giving her credit as well. So I feel like those are all things propelling her forward. I feel like she'll be a major character moving forward. But with all that said, I feel like the top two people on this list are far more likely to win than her, but she is kind of in a league of her own, even so. And because of that, I have Nina here at number three. And with that, we move to number two. And spoiler alert, it's the same top two as last week. And actually, it's even the same order. But at number two, we have Sam. I mean, again, another pretty good week for her. In episode seven, she talks about how the swap can make or break her game. She misses Mark and how their goals to get back together before the merge. In episode seven, is swapped onto the Water Tribe, has a 5-4 original numbers advantage, has a confessional about winning the reward after the swap. She feels like it'll allow her to build new relationships under the context of victory. She's happy Croc and Chrissy are reunited, but also discusses Mark's decision to go to the Blood Tribe instead of being with her. She knows Mark is very strategic, and while she isn't happy that he chose the other side, she trusts him and has to let him play his own game. She assumes it has something to do with them being targeted their last time playing and reiterates the need for Mark to play his own game so they can get to the merge together. When asked what Mark's reasoning was to the others, she plays dumb and like just says, I don't know. She doesn't like being on the same tribe as Sophie. She then talks to Sophie about her blind side, says Sophie seems all right about it, but feels like she's still determined to get it back at her, says Sophie is her target. In episode 8, she has a confessional talking about being uncomfortable with Sophie. She doesn't want Sophie to gain momentum as she's volatile. She talks to Khan and Chrissy about how dangerous Sophie is. She asks KJ who she's targeting next, but doesn't really answer. She then talks to Sophie about um, if she's targeting her. Sophie says it depends, which kind of means yes. Afterwards, she targets Sophie and puts together a split vote plan between Sophie and KJ. Meanwhile, Sophie approaches her about a separate split vote plan involving Khan. But obviously, Sans plan wins out the day there. And in episode 9, she has a confessional about her relationship now that she voted out her sister. She talks to Chrissy, who says she would vote out Michelle and KJ next. She then talks to Khan about KJ, saying KJ's pretty honest. Khan tells Sam he trusts her. He asks Khan if she would use his idol for the group, which he agrees. She says in confessional that she enjoys talking game with Khan, but knows that his idol makes him a threat. She's willing to do anything she needs to do and wonders whether to target KJ or Khan first. Khan talks to him and says he wants to target Ben, but obviously they win the challenge and it doesn't really matter. So overall, this was another solid week for Sam. I mean, after Mark decides to remain separated from her, the episode tried to make it feel like Sam was taking it personally. Although later it clarifies that she realizes it was actually a smart move strategically. She once again furthers the storyline of her and Mark getting to the merge together, and that is such a major storyline. They are really beating it down. Very clear that's going to happen. And obviously, beyond that, Sam talks about this need to let Mark play his own game, which is obviously another way of phrasing it, another major storyline there. She gets her way during the second Sophie vote, this time taking out her biggest opposition moving forward. And like I said, she's in a pretty good position. We're seeing her work fairly closely with Khan while recognizing he's a threat, which closely parallels Mark's relationship with Khan earlier in the game. So again, I feel like through that, again, they're really reinforcing their storyline. The season seems very invested in Sam and Mark's storyline, and I wouldn't be surprised if Sam, like obviously gets towards the end with Mark. And obviously, if something were to happen to Mark to where he loses the game, I feel like Sam is the next most likely person to win. However, I feel um like she's probably the less likely to win of the two. And because of that, she's here at number two. And now number one is Mark. I mean, I'm not even going to do Leah to it. It's Mark. And like I said, I feel like Mark is the clear front runner for me. I mean, I mean, just looking at this week, I mean, episode 7, he's the one to not draw a new buff at the swap, and he gets to choose which tribe he gets to be on, which kind of feels ridiculous. I mean, I feel like he probably should have been sent to exile, like, and gone to the losing tribe at the next round, but again, he just gets to choose right there, and he chooses the blood tribe, which is the correct decision, as it not only allows him to remain separated from Sam and avoid the target, but that's also the tribe where all of his original water tribe members are. And obviously they had the majority there. So obviously he's coming into there with a 6-4 original numbers advantage. Afterwards, we hear Jordy talking about how happy he is to have Mark on the tribe, saying that he looks up to Mark. Everyone is happy with his decision to stick with them, has a confessional explaining his decision. Sure enough, he says that he and Sam would have been targeted had he chosen her tribe. He hopes that they'll get to the merge together and combine their alliances, which again furthering that storyline. In episode 8, he tells Jordy, Jordan, and Josh that his allegiance lies with them and that he sees Mel as a floater. They then agree to target her, but obviously it doesn't really matter much there. And in episode 9, he talks to Amy about Jordan. She shares that they used to be close on her original tribe, but Amy feels like since the swap, Jordan has been spending more time with his cousin Josh, making her feel isolated. JL asks him about voting out Mel, which he's fine with. Amy talks to him about the Jordan plan, which he appears open to. Then, of course, he votes with the majority, votes out Amy there. So overall, Mark is still the clear frontrunner for me. Obviously, there's his decision at the swap to remain separated from Sam, which is clearly the right move there, kind of a no-brainer. But more importantly, he gets to explain afterwards how it was the correct move, and he once again furthers that storyline of him and Sam having to get to the merge together. Admittedly, he isn't that big of a factor in either of the votes in episodes 8 or 9, but even then, the episode dedicates some time to him talking game with his allies, and we see him being included on the votes. It's pretty evident that he's well positioned on the water tribe. We see people approaching him in various capacities, and it's pretty clear that they don't want to cross him or make him feel left out, which obviously bodes very well for him. So, I mean, again, what else is there to say about Mark? He's very well positioned. I feel like he's playing a very strong game, and the edit is just so blatant to me that he is a top contender. I mean, again, the only reason why I just don't say he's the clear runaway is because of Sam. But even then, I feel like his edit has been stronger than Sam's throughout. I feel like the show has gone more out of its way to show Mark than it has Sam, even though I feel like both of their edits have been pretty strong. And I feel like because of that, Mark is the most likely person to win this season. So because of that, I have Mark here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And we got some great stuff moving forward. I mean, Celebrity Brother is still happening. I mean, it wraps up next week. However, we recently got the release date for BB Can 10. Obviously, that's starting at the beginning of March. I'm very much looking forward to that. Amazing Race is still happening. Obviously, I have weekly power rankings for that. Survivor 42. I mean, we're now in the preseason for that. Obviously, that comes out March 9th, and I plan to do a preseason power ranking for that ahead of time. There's a lot of stuff happening. And of course, there's even this Australian Survivor. I mean, there's so much happening right now, and I'm excited to cover it all. So I hope you guys enjoy it. But for now, that is the video. See ya.